We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello and welcome to the latest Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. Joining me this week is Planet Holyrood legend Mark Smith, who's the Daily Record head of news, and of course the Scottish Daily Express editor Ben Borland, who, as I've said many times, is the most unlikely Lib Dem voter in the whole of Scotland. Before we start, let's just go into some feedback that we got about last week's podcast. If you recall, Ben, it was you, me, and your colleague Douglas Dickey. We were chewing the fat on the rise of the Greens, which obviously didn't really please you. The Scottish Green co-leader Ross Greer took to Twitter. I just feel compelled to read out his tweet in its entirety so there can be no sort of misinterpretation. So he said, Hutcheon, that's me, makes a valiant effort to get these two goons from the Express to understand why the Greens are surging right now, but to no avail. It's pretty simple, guys. We're giving people hope that a better Scotland is possible, one where your petty bigotries hold no sway. Would you like a right of reply?
Well, very briefly, because I don't want to just feed Ross Greer's social media channels, but I've been called far worse by far better people, and I think I'm in quite good company. J.K. Rowling is often described as a bigot for her views on women's rights. Ross's colleague Maggie Chapman described the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom judges as bigots, and Ross himself has described the Tory, or most of the Tory group, Holyrood, as bigots. So I think I'm in quite good company.
So, Ross, if you're listening to this, if you could keep this going with another tweet, preferably clipping the podcast as well, that would be great. So let's kick off. Big story this week is the UK government plan to house 300 asylum seekers in the Cameron barracks in Inverness, which I'm told is in the city centre. Now, the backdrop to this is that the Labour government is trying to move away from asylum hotels. I think there's a consensus that that policy has been an absolute disaster in terms of cost, community relations, and in terms of the treatment of the asylum seekers themselves. They're looking for a raft of alternatives. One of them seems to be using army barracks, and one of these is in Inverness. It'd be fair to say that this has gone down badly locally. There's criticism from Highland Council, local politicians. The Scottish Government is weighed in as well. Now, Smitty, I'm kind of conflicted on this. I think that the devil's always in the detail with these proposals. I think we have to look at it seriously, and there may be merit to this. But the broader point is we do have to house asylum seekers somewhere. If we're moving away from this policy of hotels, unless there's a proposal to give 300 asylum seekers flats in Inverness, surely this is something that is worthy of consideration rather than a kind of knee-jerk oppositionist, not in my backyard perspective.
Yeah, it seems like a sensible use of resources that are sitting there empty, as long as it can be done in a way which is humane. And, a lot of these asylum seekers are genuine asylum seekers, and they should not at any point, I think, feel like they're in prison. But these barracks seem like a sensible place to give people the support and the help they need in one place before their claims are processed. And for that reason, I think these barrack plans, whether it's in Inverness or near Edinburgh or in England or anywhere else in the UK, it seems to be a very sensible plan. What's staggering to me is there's a lot of people on the centre and left in Scotland who like to present themselves and they like to describe Scotland as an exceptionally welcoming place for refugees and asylum seekers. And yet, when a plan like this is mooted, suddenly, especially if it's in a marginal constituency, that welcome door seems to be shut firmly in their face. And I'm thinking here of John Swinney, who's famously been very forthcoming and saying that we welcome asylum seekers and we welcome refugees. But now he's got misgivings about this plan, which seems to me a very sensible way to take the sting out of the hotels situation. Let's be honest, the hotels' way of dealing with this was a disaster given to us by the Tories, and Labour are trying to sort that mess out. But the fears of people and the concerns of people in places like Falkirk were in many cases quite legitimate, and Labour are trying to sort that mess out. This seems like a sensible solution. I just think that there's a lot of opportunism and hypocrisy among those who are now opposing it.
I'll just read a quote from the local Lib Dem MP, Angus MacDonald. He said, "I very much thought the idea of putting them in army camps was to have them out of town and make them less of an issue for the local population." And he also said, "There is a risk that this causes major upheaval in the city centre while only housing a tiny fraction of the numbers awaiting processing." Doesn't sound very Lib Dem, does it?
No, it doesn't. No. I mean, I think the Cameron barracks previously were used to house Afghan resettlement scheme arrivals in the UK. So it's not an entirely new proposal. It's something that's been operating, and the people, the interpreters and the others who arrived after the fall of the Afghan regime that we've propped up for so long don't seem to have caused a huge issue in Inverness that I'm aware of. I don't know. It's if there's going to be 300 asylum seekers in a hotel in Perth or Falkirk, there's going to be 300 asylum seekers in barracks. Barracks does, an unused barracks does seem to be a better option than an empty hotel. I think it just.
Well, I mean, I know for a fact, Ben, that in terms of the Home Office, one of their primary concerns with the hotels policy, given how inflamed community tensions were, I think they were worried that one of these hotels was going to be set on fire. And so, army barracks, by their very nature, will be more secure. Now, I've got concerns about how far are the asylum seekers' liberties going to be restricted? I mean, are they effectively going to be under curfew? Are they going to have normal lives? Can they actually integrate into the community, help out? I think these are good questions. But the principle doesn't seem to be too alarming.
I think there's an argument you could say perhaps there should be some restrictions. This is a
they can't work. So this is a massive restriction.
It's a temporary situation, and if an asylum seeker is granted leave to remain, then they move out of the barracks. So this is a temporary home, and perhaps there is an argument to say. I don't know. I think it's such a difficult issue at the moment. I think it would be helped a great deal if the number of people crossing the channel on small boats were to be, cut down, and if we'd finally get to grips with that issue.
That'll be the real solution to this problem: is that genuine asylum seekers more quickly get the help and the support they need and the decision they need, and that can be done in an efficient manner. Obviously, the backlog that was there was massive because the Tories just decided just to leave it. But the chancellors who are there, who are clearly just here from all corners of the world trying to illegally enter Britain and illegally stay in Britain, they need to be shipped out. And that should be done quickly, and that'll be the real solution to the problem. But just one thing to say is that you mentioned the camps idea a few weeks ago on this very podcast.
Yes.
So I'm hoping that Keir Starmer may have heard our exchange and decided on that policy.
I think one thing that gets me in this is, I've said it before, this is about, in terms of Scotland, it's about a fair distribution of asylum seekers across the whole country. So, I did a story a few weeks back. Per 10,000 population in Glasgow has 58 asylum seekers. The figure, as of June this year for the Highlands, 0. The Highlands is a vast local authority area. Are we seriously suggesting there should be no asylum seekers housed across the whole of the Highlands?
Yeah.
And I think that the people who are against this army barracks plan, they may be opposed to it for legitimate reasons, but do they accept the principle that there should be some asylum seekers in Inverness? Because I'm not sure that they do. I think that they just think it's going to be someone else's problem, and maybe have them just put in Glasgow.
Frankly, that's a typical Lib Dem response. They have high ideals based on the writings of Hume, and they would talk about Gladstonian, history. See, when it comes down to it, they're just a bunch of Tories. Never trust a Lib Dem is my theory, because behind every Lib Dem, when you pull the mask, it's just a Tory in disguise underneath.
Do you remember in Edinburgh, their policy nationally, this was a few years ago, was to support congestion charging, and then there was the local referendum in Edinburgh, and they opposed it.
Exactly. That's always been their style. I mean, that's how they got a big foothold in local government by supporting all sorts of reactionary right-wing political positions. And this chap in Inverness, MacDonald, is just part of that fine liberal tradition. He's saying one thing and doing another.
I think, though, this is a Labour policy, and it was actually proposed by the Tories a few years ago to house asylum seekers in military bases.
And Labour opposed it.
And Labour opposed it. And now suddenly, and we mentioned it a few weeks, it was actually Andrew Neil who'd written a column saying, why not house asylum seekers in empty barracks? And there was this huge reaction, that's a terrible... And gradually all these ideas that were considered beyond the pale by Labour and the sort of left-wing establishment are now actually coming... And
it's almost like this entire debate is dripping in hypocrisy and double standards.
Absolutely. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if we end up back at the Rwanda plan at some point in this parliament.
I mean, it's the absolute disaster of the hotels policy which has led us here. There might have been a time in the past where it might have seemed like an army barracks was a shocking place to keep someone who was seeking asylum, but with the absolute, disaster of this, the hotels policy, which the Tories obviously left us with. Well, that's why we are where we are.
The Tories brought that in during COVID. That was a COVID measure. And like so many COVID measures, it then proved impossible to back away from it. And the ever-increasing numbers, more and more. So it wasn't a policy of, let's put asylum seekers in hotels because we think it's a good idea. It was, we're in the middle of the pandemic, let's find a quick, easy solution. And then it snowballed from there.
I think, one of the most disturbing criticisms of this is this idea that, the asylum seekers are going to be close to the local population. Like, they're not supposed to go to the library, they're not supposed to go to the shops, they're not allowed to talk to people. I mean, it's just this othering of asylum seekers that we're getting just seems to be really horrible. I mean, I take your point, Ben, there will be restrictions on movements, but they are human beings as well, and they do need to be treated with dignity.
If the system works and it works quickly, they won't be there for long. So that's the point. They shouldn't be there for long. I think as well, it's so hard to avoid the headlines. I think there's another case down south of an asylum seeker who's been found guilty of a murder in Derby this time. So there are these headline-making crimes, and it's making people think that every asylum seeker is dangerous, whereas obviously there are dangerous individuals, and we don't seem to be able to stop the dangerous individuals and help the majority that need the help.
All right, moving on. The IPPR think tank, I think, had an event today in Edinburgh. John Swinney was there and Sarwar was there. I think they gave different speeches. I think John Swinney's message was that we need an SNP government re-elected in order to stand up to reform. He was raising the spectre of a Farage government, dismantling devolution, and why we need a nationalist government in Scotland to act as a sort of bulwark against that. And Sarwar's speech was very much calling time on nearly 2 decades of SNP rule and putting forward a Labour alternative. It was kind of like the Holyrood campaign in miniature, wasn't it? Those are the sort of the tram lines, as it were, of the debate. Swinney talking about Farage and reform, whereas Sarwar very much wants to have the conversation focused on the record of the SNP in government.
I mean, you would hope that the election campaign will be about those public services which Holyrood has control of and which are failing catastrophically. That should be what the election's about. This attempt, both Farage and Swinney are on the same boat here. They both want this to be about flags and identity, when it should always be about class. I would say that because I'm a bit of a lefty, but it should be about workers and how they are treated, how their cost of living, how workers are able to, how people are able to, families able to get by in their day-to-day lives, but also the public services that working people rely on. The SNP government have been failing on that. And I'm not somebody who's against this SNP government, and I think Swinney is a very astute politician and a very able guy. And I think he's still got a chance to show that he can actually deliver on public services. But that's what the election should be about. And the attempt by Swinney and Farage to squeeze Labour and make this about flags is I think, shameful. One thing I will say on that, just as almost a side issue, where I live in West Edinburgh, a bit of a Gorgie boy, there's saltires all along the Calder roads, right? Now, you think, oh, those saltires must be put up there by strong SNP supporting, Braveheart types. No, they're put up there by a bunch of Reform voters in West Edinburgh who want to chuck out everyone who is foreign. Now, is that really what we want in this election? That Reform and the SNP waving their saltires to see who is the most Scottish out of us all? No, that is not what we want this election to be about.
See, Ben, after the general election, I think we all assumed it was going to be just a dogfight between the SNP and Labour in terms of the election. But if you think about it, and the way this contest is going, Reform are just going to try and make this about asylum and immigration. They're probably going to focus on so-called pressures on public services caused by immigration and asylum. There's a sort of third spoke in this campaign that we didn't really anticipate would have been there this time last year. I mean, it is a three-way campaign, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, I think, as we've said many times, Anna Sarwar's biggest problem is Keir Starmer and the UK government, and they haven't made a major blunder for a couple of weeks now, which seems quite astonishing. And that's his biggest problem. I didn't see the speeches, but I've heard a summary. I think Anna Sarwar spoke about cutting income tax in Scotland, which I think our readers would be hugely in favour of.
It's the obvious move for them to make.
It's such, it's so unfair that. But you talk about working people in Scotland pay more in tax than.
That's the thing. It's very hard to make an argument for progressive taxation or more progressive taxation when the money seems to get squandered all the time, whether it's bottle schemes that fail, whether it's, legal fights over the trans issue, which were a complete waste of effort. There's so much money gets poured down a big drain. It's really hard to make the argument that the rich should get taxed more when so much of that money gets wasted. I still think, though, there's a progressive argument to be made for increased taxation, but the money has got to be used properly. And if Labour can say, well, we'll cut taxes and deliver better public services, that'd be some trick to pull off. But if they can do that, they might be onto a winner there.
I think Anas wants to ramp it up in January. The problem he faces is that I think Reform are going to take a lot of the oxygen away from him. That he will want the microphone constantly, and yet just by the very nature of politics, so much of the focus is going to be in Reform. He has to seize the narrative, has to marginalise them. To what extent he can do that, I think it's going to be very difficult because we know the dog whistles that Reform are going to be going for. I mean, we got a foretaste of that in the Hamilton by-election with that racist ad.
Yeah.
The fact that they put 25k into that makes me think that it was successful for them. I mean, this is shaping up to be the dirtiest, ugliest Holyrood election campaign in living memory, I think.
I think I personally can't see any other result than an SNP win. I just think Labour, they haven't got the momentum, and they're in this dogfight with Reform, and I just see the SNP taking advantage of that. The one thing I would say, though, I think is from a pro-UK voters perspective, I don't think Swinney's going to come anywhere near a majority, which rules out another referendum campaign. And I think there's a chance. There was a poll at the weekend showing that the actual pro-independence majority is kind of in the balance. Reform, Labour, Tories, Lib Dems could form the majority in Holyrood next time.
Good luck putting that coalition together.
Well, it wouldn't be. I still think it would end up being an SNP minority government, but I just think a pro-UK, which will be the first pro-UK majority since 2007, puts the independence issue to bed, which a lot of Express readers.
Or even the SNP falling short of 65.
That does put it to bed, but I think if they've still got that pro-indie majority that's so cherished, if that goes, then it really is a dead dodo.
Is there a case for in a parliament where the SNP might be by far the largest party, but not quite a majority, where there's clearly the people have spoken but not delivered a thumping majority for independence? That in the interest of service delivery, we have an SNP Labour coalition to try working together on some big issues, even if it's a confidence and supply agreement. Like might that be a better way for Scotland to actually be governed properly? Because the SNP, it looks like they need a bit of a hand in getting things right. And maybe there might be able people within the Labour movement that could help them there. I can't remember. It sounds fanciful because they hate each other, two tribes,
Raiders and Celtic coming together.
You never know. They're both trying to come together to beat Hearts this season. So, if they can do that, I'm sure others can.
Speaking of pro-independence politicians, I've got an interview with Stephen Flynn. It's coming out tomorrow's paper. John Swinney is in a pretty good position just now as leader, but there is a bit of chat about who's going to replace him, because there's a feeling that John Swinney won't be First Minister SNP leader for all that long. And the two names in the frame are Stephen Flynn, Mary McCallan. But I spoke to him at Westminster this week, and I'll just read you the quote. He seems to be downplaying talk of him as a potential successor. As a young parent, I struggle to find myself in a mindset where I would want to miss out on my kids growing up, because whilst I have a profound duty to people who I am very lucky to represent now and hopefully the future, and to my nation, I've got a higher responsibility to my kids, and that weighs very heavily on me. I just understand what's important to me and what's right when it comes to how I prioritise my life. I spend a lot of time away from my family, which is tough. I spend a lot of time away from my kids, which is very hard. It puts a lot of strain on my wife, who does a fantastic job making sure that they're lovely wee boys. I would not want to put barriers in place to the relationship that I have with them. So, doesn't sound massively enthusiastic about being Swinney's successor, does he?
No, it doesn't. That's quite strong.
Yeah, that's really
strong. My heart tells me that him saying I don't want to be First Minister is a bit like me saying I don't want to be John Robertson in 1989, or I don't want to be Sean Connery in 1965, I think he does want to be First Minister.
I think it's hard to...
I know. I mean, I think he's framing it in the context of young kids. So I think when Swinney...
I'm
not sure, but I mean, they'll be older, obviously. And I think maybe when Swinney does stand down, maybe they won't be young kids anymore. But, just take it at face value. He's putting up obstacles.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to come back from that and say, because in order to then launch a leadership campaign, he basically has to say, actually, I no longer want to spend much time with my kids. I've had enough of them.
Oh, Salmon famously U-turned, remember, the second time.
Last I will do it. Yes,
So, I mean, I think people forgive politicians for U-turning when it comes to saying when they're going to quit and if they're going to stand for leadership. But, I mean, right now, I thought it was interesting that he wasn't exactly rushing to pick up the baton.
He maybe just thinks now is not the time. But when the time does come, possibly in 5 or 6 years, I think he'll be well up for it. I think, if there's more, I think he'd be quite an effective SNP leader.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose he's looking to switch to Holyrood. He'll get to spend more time at home in Aberdeen. I mean, and also, if you're First Minister, you can move the kids into Butte House, surely. I mean, Jack McConnell's kids lived in Butte House.
There's enough wiggle room in there, I think, for him to make a dignified U-turn at some point in the future. Okay, that's great. Thanks very much to Mark and to Ben for joining me. And you can listen to this episode of Planet Holyrood on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or watch it on the Records YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.